After 10 years of marriage, Damien achieved fame and success with my help. Yet he also hated me to the core all along. After I died, he annexed my family's company and married his first love from childhood. On the day they got married, Cashin, who had a childhood betrothal with me and later became my sworn enemy, detonated the wedding venue. Before the flames devoured everything, Cashin smiled and said, "She's dead, leaving you to rise rapidly in the world." How could there be such a good thing in the world? When I opened my eyes again, I had traveled back to 10 years ago. I was pulling Damien along to ask Cashin to break off the engagement that day. He looked at me indifferently. "Have you thought it through? Are you really going to break off the engagement with me for him?" "Serafina, I never look back. Have you really thought it through? Are you really going to break off the engagement with me for such a nobody?" When the familiar cold male voice rang out, I was still immersed in the aftertaste of that explosion. The overwhelming bright flames seemed to be able to burn even my soul floating in midair. Cashin held a gun in his hand, stood in the middle of the flames, pulled the trigger, and smiled at the enraged Damien. "She's dead, leaving you to rise rapidly in the world." How could there be such a good thing in the world? Cashin held a gun in his hand, stood in the middle of the flames, pulled the trigger, and smiled at the enraged Damien. "She's dead, leaving you to rise rapidly in the world." How could there be such a good thing in the world? I took a liking to Damien, who was still a poor student at that time, and coerced him with his mother's medical expenses. I made him accept my financial support and date me. Damien thought that I had humiliated him with money, so he hated me for many years. After getting married, while conspiring with others to annex my family's company, he also had an affair with his first love from childhood. Later, he drove me crazy bit by bit, sent me to a mental hospital, and watched me fall to my death from a building. Then he transformed himself into a newly emerging wealthy man and married his first love from childhood. I finally understood. Cashin and I were childhood sweethearts and had been inseparable since we were young. Why, in my previous life, as soon as Damien appeared, I fell in love with him as if I had lost my mind. Coming back to my senses, I looked around. I saw the parents on both sides with different expressions on their faces. And Cashin, who was sitting on the sofa with cold eyes, looking up at me. Suddenly, I remembered. In my previous life, it was today that I completely broke with Cashin. The Serafina family and the Cashin family were old family friends, and today was supposed to be the day for the two families to have a routine gathering. However, I was late and also brought Damien along. I opened my mouth and asked Cashin to break off the engagement. "I've never liked you, and besides, I already have a boyfriend now." "So, you came to break off the engagement with me just for such a nobody?" Cashin pushed up the gold-rimmed glasses on his nose. His eyes fell on Damien beside me with undisguised contempt. Damien straightened his back and retorted, "What are you so proud of? You're just a bit better off in terms of family background." "A bit better off?" Cashin curled the corners of his mouth, pulling out a sarcastic smile. "You'd better figure it out. If it weren't for Serafina bringing you here, you wouldn't even have to stand in front of me and speak." This sentence really hurt Damien's fragile self-esteem severely. In my previous life, I watched his eyes turn red with humiliation, and my heart ached terribly. Immediately, I stood in front of him and blurted out words to retort against Cashin. I cursed him for being delusional and pestering me. "Don't think I don't know. That boy who wrote me a love letter in high school was hit by a car and had his leg broken for no reason. It was you who did it, right? Cashin, I feel disgusted just looking at you. Except for having a better family background, what else about you can compare with Damien?" I said a lot of mean things, but Cashin didn't refute a single word. He sat silently in his place, as if he had turned into a frozen statue. After a long while, he pressed on his glasses and said calmly, "Okay, I agree to break off the engagement." Damien turned around coldly. "Serafina, did you bring me here just to let people humiliate me?" I pinched the palm of my hand hard to pull my mind out of the chaos of just being reborn. Hearing this sentence, I suddenly laughed. "Humiliate? Cashin was just stating the facts. Someone like you is just for me to play with. Are you worthy of his wasting more words on you? You think too highly of yourself, Damien. As soon as these words came out, the whole living room suddenly fell silent. Everyone looked at me in astonishment. From 2 steps away on the sofa, Cashin suddenly raised his head. Behind the glasses were a pair of glassy, fragile and clear eyes with a look of astonishment that hadn't been concealed yet. What did you say? Damien's expression became extremely embarrassed. I said, don't you think you can compare with my fiancé in any way? He always ignores me when doing business. I'm unhappy, so I just used you to annoy him. I let go of his hand and took a step back, as if trying to avoid something dirty. I gave the order to leave. Now, you can get out. Damien looked at me in disbelief. But he was invited out by the butler who had come to his senses. Before leaving, he said harsh words, Serafina, I'm not someone you can summon and dismiss at will. Next time, even if you kneel in front of me and beg me, I won't make up with you. He was so confident. I was really speechless. But at this moment, I had no time to care about Damien. I trotted to Cashin's side and crouched down. In my previous life, it was a long time after the engagement was broken off that I learned that Cashin had been admitted to the hospital that night. He had been sitting on the sofa without getting up that day because his stomach problem flared up when he was doing business abroad. But because he really wanted to see me, he still managed to rush back. However, when I saw him for the first time, I opened my mouth and asked to break off the engagement. I was really such an idiot. Our eyes met, and a look of sudden understanding flashed across Cashin's eyes. He smiled sarcastically. Are you using me to annoy your boyfriend again? It was no wonder that Cashin thought so. In my previous life, I had indeed done stupid things like using Cashin to annoy Damien to prove that he cared about me. Now I could only soften my voice and pretend to be stupid. What boyfriend? Cashin, you're the only fiancé I have. He looked down at me. I'm not feeling well. Could you accompany me to the hospital first? Cashin suddenly frowned. Where don't you feel well? Do you have menstrual cramps again? Without thinking, I said, yes, menstrual cramps. He turned his head and glanced at me. It doesn't seem to be your menstrual period today. Because of Damien, we had actually been in a cold war for a long time. I didn't expect that he still remembered my menstrual period. My heart was suddenly filled with a sour and astringent emotion. Well, that is, it came early. I carefully grasped the cuff of his sleeve and shook it. I need to get a pain-killing injection. Will you accompany me there, okay? Cashin didn't know what he was thinking. After a moment of silence, he calmly replied, okay. When we got into the car, I called the driver over and didn't allow Cashin to drive. He didn't insist either and just sat side by side with me in the back seat. However, there was a distance of one person between us. I asked in a low voice, Cashin, are you angry with me? He curved the corners of his mouth slightly. He said self-mockingly, how dare I? These 4 words made my heart be swallowed up by overwhelming guilt. In my previous life, controlled by the plot, my parents couldn't persuade me and could only watch me marry Damien. I used the family's business to dutifully transfuse blood to his company. Because Cashin was always competing with Damien and snatching his projects. So I regarded him as my sworn enemy. In those 10 years in my previous life, during the few times we met, I was always cold and mean to him and never gave him a good look. Cashin. I sniffed and suddenly said, we haven't seen each other for 2 months. Did you miss me? Cashin turned his head and looked at me. He didn't say anything. I felt a bit embarrassed and had to make conversation. You didn't bring me a gift when you came back this time. I brought one last time but you thought my things were dirty and threw them away. He said coldly and then turned his head away and closed his eyes. It was obviously a resistant gesture that he was too lazy to communicate with me anymore. Last time when Cashin returned to the country, he brought me a whole box of rubies. When he handed them over, he casually said, take them and make some little trinkets to play with. Don't stay with inferior things all day long. Both the rubies themselves and Cashin's words stabbed Damien's male pride. So in order to make Damien happy, I immediately threw the box of gems back at him. I don't care for your dirty things at all. Thinking of this, I closed my eyes in despair. In my heart, I cursed the original plot for being so stupid. Only someone with a 10-year blood clot in the brain could write it like that. In reality, I could only gradually shorten the distance between us and move closer to Cashin. I turned sideways, pressed close to him, put my chin on his shoulder, and said softly, "Actually, Cashin, I have something to tell you." The warm breath I exhaled created a small stream of air, blowing the strands of hair scattered around his ears. Cashin suddenly opened his eyes, raised his hand, grabbed the back of my collar, and pulled me aside. "No matter what the reason is for you and that Damien to put on this show today, I won't listen. Don't waste your energy." He frowned, paused for a moment. "Also don't move around if you're not feeling well." When Cashin reprimanded me, his face was stern and his expression was cold. However, I keenly noticed that the area from his earlobe to his neck turned red. And he also deliberately adjusted to an awkward sitting posture. "Cashin." I tentatively called him. "You wouldn't sit properly." He lowered his eyelashes, hiding the surging undercurrent of desire in his eyes. His voice was a bit hoarse. "You don't need to worry about my affairs." When the car stopped at the entrance of the hospital, the cold and tense atmosphere between Cashin and me had eased a lot. Thinking that he was suffering from a stomachache, I used the excuse that I wanted him to support me and took his arm. Suddenly, a sweet female voice full of anger came from the side, "Serafina." I turned my head and saw Delilah, Damien's first love from childhood, rush in front of me, glaring at me angrily. "You did it on purpose, didn't you? You deliberately cut off Aunt Song's medicine just to force Damien to bow his head to you." She looked at the back of me and her eyes suddenly turned red. "You said before that as long as I disappeared, you would invite that senior tumor expert to come out and treat Aunt Song. Are you going to go back on your word now, Delilah?" Damien quickly walked forward from behind me, pulled Delilah over, and protected her behind him. Then he lowered his eyebrows and said in a humble tone, "Serafina, it's all my fault. I'm not angry about what you did to me today. Please don't make things difficult for Delilah and my mother. From now on, I'll obediently listen to you." I suddenly realized. In my previous life the expert who treated Damien's mother was invited by me through the connections of the Cashin family. No, before I could open my mouth my arm suddenly became empty. Cashin pulled his arm out of mine, lowered his eyes, and smiled mockingly. His eyes were full of understanding and bone-chilling coldness. "Now I know why you suddenly asked me to send you to the hospital. Serafina, is this what you wanted to tell me?" I was all too familiar with the expression on Cashin's face that seemed cold and sharp yet as fragile as shattered glass. In my past life, every time I confronted him because of Damien, he would look at me like this. At that time, I was bound by the original plot and focused all my attention on Damien. I just thought Cashin was so pretentious and really annoying. But now, I felt a sharp pain in my heart and subconsciously retorted, "No." However, he no longer looked at me but just coldly stared at Damien. "Since you look down on me, then show some real skills. You even have to bring my fiancé along to put on this show when treating your mother's illness. Aren't you ashamed?" Damien gritted his teeth hard, and a look of humiliation flashed in his eyes. "Cashin, don't think you're so great." He clenched his fists and said coldly, "One day, you'll pay the price for what you said today." Cashin ignored him and walked away without looking back. I was about to chase after him when Damien grabbed me. "Serafina." He looked at me with his eyebrows slightly drooping and his voice a bit hoarse. "Serafina, it's all my fault. Don't be angry." When his cold fingers grasped my wrist, I remembered all the things in my past life and just felt as if a cold and venomous snake was coiling around me. "Don't touch me. It's disgusting." Caught off guard, I shook him off. Damien was a bit stunned. Obviously, he couldn't believe it. After all, in the past, no matter how angry I was, as long as he was willing to give in a little, I would back down without a bottom line. "Serafina." He was about to say something else but was forcibly interrupted by me. "Since you've always thought that I was humiliating you by spending money, transfer the $600,000 that I spent on treating your mother's illness to my card within 3 days. Let me see how much backbone you really have. Running all the way in high heels, I finally caught up with Cashin at the entrance of the hospital. Cashin! I panted and grabbed his sleeve. Before I could open my mouth, he turned his head sideways. Serafina, there is indeed some old affection between you and me. But that doesn't mean you can rely on this and make me give in without a bottom line for your little boyfriend. After saying this coldly, he wanted to pull his sleeve back, but I held on tightly. It has nothing to do with him. Alright, I admit that I didn't come to the hospital because of menstrual cramps. I wanted to bring you here. Your stomach problem has flared up again, right? Cashin, don't think I don't know that you don't eat properly when you go out to talk business. He looked at me in surprise, and his eyes scanned my eyebrows and eyes inch by inch, as if trying to tell whether what I said was true or false from my expression. Seeing that his expression softened a little, I quickly pressed on with my advantage. I dragged and pulled him into the consulting room. The doctor took his examination report and frowned tightly. For chronic gastritis, you should pay special attention to your diet. Especially when you don't feel well, don't force yourself. Come to the hospital for treatment as soon as possible. Get an intravenous drip for 2 days first. The sunlight shone through the glass window and filled the room without obstruction. When only Cashin and I were left in the ward, the air suddenly became quiet. I ordered a bowl of porridge on the takeout app. After it was delivered, I blew on it with a small spoon to cool it down and then fed it to him at his lips. Cashin lowered his eyelashes, not knowing what he was thinking. The doctor said you should eat something, or your stomach will feel uncomfortable when you get the infusion later, I reminded him. Finally, he was willing to look up at me. His eyes, illuminated by the sunlight, reflected glistening waves. Okay. He replied in a low voice and finally opened his mouth. After drinking half a bowl of porridge, Cashin motioned for me to put the bowl down. Phone. I handed him my phone with a puzzled look. I watched as he typed in a string of numbers. What's this? Director Fong's phone number, the tumor expert you've been longing to invite out of retirement. I suddenly raised my head and saw Cashin's pale face and the faint bitter smile on his lips. I suddenly understood. Up to now, he still thought that I had ulterior motives. You sent me to the hospital, and I gave you what you wanted. So I don't owe you anything. I don't want you to bring up what happened today the next time you come to beg me for him and say that you feel disgusted just looking at me eating porridge. Serafina, I'm also human. The sunlight shone obliquely, spreading a rare vulnerability on his cold and stern eyebrows. I suddenly felt a lump in my throat and couldn't say a word. I remembered what Cashin said. 3 months ago, for a project that Damien's studio wanted to get, Cashin was the decision-maker on the client's side. So I went to pester him, cooked a meal for him, and brought gifts. When Cashin was happy, I asked him, could you loosen up a bit and let Damien and them do that project? The smile on Cashin's lips faded almost instantly. He put down his chopsticks and looked at me. So, you came to find me today still for your boyfriend? Damien is really capable. I tried to argue but was interrupted by his cold and solemn voice. A capable person won't need to rely on you to get through the back door to win a project. Go back. I've already read the proposal and made a decision. I won't choose him. Cashin stood up, pulled out the chair, and gave the order to leave. I was so angry that I lost and pointed at his nose and cursed. If it weren't for Damien, I wouldn't want to see you at all. Just seeing you eat the meal I cooked makes me feel sick enough. Suddenly, a hand reached out in my hazy vision and wiped the moisture from the corner of my eye. Only then did I realize that I was crying. Cashin withdrew his hand and said faintly, don't feel wronged. After today, I won't look for you again. Serafina, we're even. I had a bad record before, so it was normal for him not to believe me. While convincing myself in my heart, I forcibly held back my tears and looked at Cashin seriously. Sorry. He was slightly stunned. You can't force things in matters of feelings. There's no need to apologize. After I leave the hospital today, I'll make it clear to your parents and we'll break. Before he could finish his words, he was blocked by my sudden kiss. Cashin's eyes widened suddenly, and he looked at me in disbelief. I rubbed my lips against his a bit clumsily for a while and then backed away a little, clutching his collar and gasping softly. No, don't say anything about breaking off the engagement. I calmed down a bit and continued, Cashin, whether you believe it or not, those things related to Damien before weren't what I wanted to do. I sent you to the hospital just because I saw that you didn't look well and was worried about your health. He looked down at me, and the emotions surging in his eyes were covered by his long eyelashes, making them unclear. Is this another new tactic of yours? I suppressed the bitterness in my heart. We've known each other for as long as I've lived, so you can't not believe me. If you don't believe me, I'll kiss you again. As I said this, I was about to lean forward again. But Cashin stopped me in time by pressing his forehead against mine. His breath was right next to me, and his voice was a bit hoarse. Serafina, do you know what you're doing now? I replied, yes, I'm doing what we did when we were 18. This sentence was like the fuse that set everything on fire. In an instant, it burned away all the rationality of Cashin and me. On the night after the college entrance examination, my family specially held a banquet to celebrate for me. I drank a few glasses of champagne, got drunk, and dragged Cashin into my room. I asked him, what does kissing feel like? He looked at me quietly, Serafina, you're drunk. I was a bit unhappy. Don't change the subject. If you don't tell me, I'll go find someone else. Before I could finish my words, Cashin suddenly pinched my chin and leaned in to kiss me. A faint fragrance of lemongrass came from him. It seemed to be the gift I gave him on his birthday this year. His lips, tongue, and the fingers pressed against my neck were all burning hot. My head was dizzy, and soon I could only hold on to his front by clutching it tightly, forced to endure the overwhelming heat that followed. Cashin's voice was tinged with hidden desire. This is what kissing feels like. Do you want to go deeper, Serafina? At that time, we were so good and so close. I always thought that after graduating from university, I would marry Cashin. But after entering university, still at the first sight of Damien, I was bewitched and dragged into the vortex of the original plot. How could the needle slip out when you're lying in the ward? The nurse came to give Cashin another injection and then gave a worried reminder. Don't move around anymore. There's only one more bottle left to finish. Cashin nodded calmly. On the contrary, I, who was sitting beside him, rubbed my hot ears. After the nurse left, I apologized in a low voice, sorry. I had kissed too passionately just now. I pressed on Cashin's arm, which caused the intravenous infusion needle to shift its position, and blood soaked the whole piece of adhesive tape red. He looked at me, there's no need to apologize. Then are you willing to believe me? It depends on your performance. Although he said so, his tone had already softened. At the end of this month, Cashin went to the neighboring city to talk about business. I went back to school for classes and didn't forget to send him messages whenever I had time, trying to prove to him with my actions that he was the only one in my heart. Cashin's birthday was coming soon. One afternoon, I wanted to go to the mall to pick out a gift for him. Suddenly, I saw a familiar figure in the distance. It was Damien. Because I had spoken too harshly to him at the hospital that day, he hadn't contacted me in the past few days. I was also happy to be free of trouble. But now, at a time when he should have been busy in the studio, he followed a young man into the garden restaurant beside. My heart tightened immediately, and I took a few steps forward. At the moment when I entered the door, that man happened to look up. It was like a bolt from the blue, and I froze on the spot. This man was none other than Mordred, who cooperated with Damien in my past life and sent the Cashin and Serafina families to a dead end. I secretly followed them and hid behind several clusters of green plants. Coincidentally, I heard their conversation. Cashin has already gone to Haicheng. It seems that he didn't notice there was a problem with that project. Project? Damien sneered, and his voice was cold and gloomy. I want more than just his company. I want his life. In my past life, I often felt strange too. Cashin came from the Cashin family and was the most outstanding child of this generation. He got an MBA from the most prestigious business school at the age of 20 and then returned to China to take over his family's company. Why on earth did Cashin lose to Damien time and time again? In the end, even more than half of his family's company was annexed by Damien. Was it just because Damien had the halo of the male lead? Or did he hold some special information in his hands? What was the project in Haicheng that they mentioned? Countless questions swirled in my mind. I really wanted to ask Cashin, but I was afraid that if he clashed with Damien in advance, it would instead prompt the development of the original plot and push Cashin towards the fated ending again. After thinking it over, I decided to start with Damien to gather information. To prevent Cashin from getting into danger under the influence of the original plot. After returning home, I asked the nanny to make some soup and then took it to the hospital. Sure enough, I ran into Damien in the ward. He gave me a cold glance and didn't say a word. I put on an appearance of swallowing my anger and edged over, tugging at his sleeve. Trying hard to recall my previous coquettish and vulnerable tone, I said, "You're not still angry with me, are you? I'm also feeling aggrieved. You clearly promised me that you wouldn't have any more contact with Delilah. But when I came to the hospital, she was still here, and she even shouted at me rudely. Who does she think she is?" A look of disgust flashed in Damien's eyes, but he concealed it well. "I've already asked her to leave," he said indifferently. "She came that day also because she was worried about my mother's health. It won't happen again. It'd better be so. Don't forget that I'm your girlfriend." I said, "I've asked Cashin these days. He said he'd help get that expert to come out and perform the operation for Andy. But we'll have to wait for a while. There's been some problem with a project he wants to invest in recently." Damien's Adam's apple bobbed, and suddenly he turned his head to look at me. "What problem?" I pretended to be trying hard to recall. "It seems to be related to something in the suburbs of Haicheng." For the whole day that followed, Damien's attitude towards me suddenly became a lot more enthusiastic. He had been subtly asking me whether Cashin knew something or not. And I pretended to be making up with him. Finally, he took me to a dinner with Mordred and others. Before setting off, I felt a bit guilty for no reason, so I called Cashin, wanting to let him know. But his phone was turned off. After thinking it over, I thought I couldn't miss such a good opportunity. In the private dining room with excellent privacy, Mordred raised his glass to me. "Serafina, I'm interested in investing in Damien's studio." "I'm Mordred. Perhaps we'll have a chance to cooperate in the future." I remembered that in my previous life, it was he who helped Damien destroy most of the Cashin family and annex my family's business. I could only force myself to endure the disgust and exchange pleasantries with him. After several rounds of drinking, he seemingly casually said, "I heard that the Serafina family and the Cashin family are old family friends, and Serafina and Cashin, the current head of the Cashin family, were also engaged?" "What engagement?" "It's just something made up by the adults of the two families. He always makes things difficult for Xiao. I hate him to death." I looked at Damien. "Since I was a child, I've only liked one person, and that's Xiao. If it weren't for Xiao, I wouldn't put up with him and pretend to be friendly with him." While saying these words, all I could think of in my mind were the faces of Damien and Mordred. The hatred I showed was so real and deep that several people in the private room burst out laughing. Serafina really has a discerning eye and can see through the true face of a hypocrite like Cashin. Mordred smiled and leaned over. "Well, would it be convenient for you to tell me what he's going to do in Haicheng?" Feeling the effects of the alcohol, I stood up. "Excuse me. I'm not feeling well in my stomach. I'll go to the washroom." I walked on my high heels, a bit dizzy, to the door of the private room, opened the door. A gust of cold wind mixed with a faint scent of lemongrass blew over. The light spread a thin layer on the familiar handsome face of the person in front of me. I shuddered and suddenly sobered up completely. Cashin stood expressionless at the door. When he saw me, he suddenly curled the corners of his mouth slightly. "Serafina, so this is how it is." The light in the corridor was a warm yellow. But when it fell on Cashin's face, it was bone-chillingly cold. He had heard everything. Among the mixed smells, I suddenly grasped a thread of my chaotic thoughts. So the surging drunkenness dissipated in an instant. My fingers gripping the doorknob trembled, and I had a bad feeling inside. Subconsciously, I called out, "Cashin. Better not call me that, lest you disgust yourself again." He swept over with disappointed and icy cold eyes. Then he looked over my shoulder at Damien and Mordred behind me. "If you want to know what I'm going to do in Haicheng, why don't you dare to ask me directly?" He chuckled and his voice became a bit more resolute and sharp, like a blade in battle. "Do you think inserting a few spies in my company can influence my judgment? Your methods are as ridiculous as you are." He was already tall, and now that he stood up straight like this, his gaze towards those people was looking down from a height, with an obvious sense of superiority. Clowns. After saying this, he turned around and left. In the private room, Damien's face darkened and suddenly he raised his hand and overturned the plate. "What are you so proud of? Do you think these are all the means I have? One day, I'll watch him die in front of me with my own eyes." I couldn't wait to slap him twice in my heart, but thinking of the original plot, I still didn't dare to be careless. I could only force a smile. "I'll go back with Cashin first and ask him what he's actually found out." After saying that, I grabbed my bag and left. I chased all the way downstairs and just saw Cashin getting into the car. "Cashin." I took 2 breaths and said hurriedly, "Listen to me. I came here today to find out what exactly Damien and the others have plotted against you." Through the half-opened car window, facing Cashin's calm gaze like still water, my voice suddenly stopped. He raised his hand and propped up his chin leisurely, as if listening to some interesting joke. He even curved the corners of his mouth and laughed softly. "Well, are you still going to say that it's all because you like me? You're worried about my safety, and you're afraid that I can't handle them alone." The boundless anxiety and panic were like bubbles on the sea surface, rising up from the bottom of my heart one after another. I pinched my palm and forced myself to calm down and explain seriously, "Yes, I know you don't believe me, but Damien is not as simple as you think. If his means were only what he's shown, I wouldn't." "Serafina." Cashin suddenly interrupted me. Through the gradually closing car window, I saw his eyes that seemed to be completely shattered yet still beautiful. "You can't rely on the fact that I love you and tolerate you to deceive me time and time again without a bottom line. Let's not contact each other anymore." After saying this, the car window closed completely, and the reflective film blocked everything. The black Rolls-Royce drove away without hesitation. I was left alone on the spot. The slightly cool night wind blew over, and suddenly I shivered. In my previous life, after I married Damien, Cashin had reminded me more than once that Damien had a wolfish ambition and told me to be careful. But no matter what he said, I didn't believe him. I even sneered and mocked him. "Aren't you just jealous of Xiao, jealous that he was born ordinary but now stands at a higher position than you? You're a hypocrite full of lies. I won't believe a word you say." At that time, Cashin stood in front of me, wearing a well-tailored suit, but his eyes were full of a hurt look. Coming back to my senses, I was already in the car and asked the driver to drive to the Cashin family's residence. However, Cashin didn't go back to the old house or his own home. The car drove around most of the city and finally stopped downstairs at his company. I looked up and saw that there was still a light on in the office on the top floor. Thinking of the sharp and resistant look on his face before the car window closed, I suddenly felt a bit timid in my heart. So I went to the convenience store nearby, bought a can of beer, drank it all in one go to boost my courage. When the drunkenness gradually came back, I walked into the elevator and pressed the button. Cashin's office was on the 39th floor and had high privacy, but he had never set up defenses against me. When I opened the door, the huge office was empty. In the lounge with the door closed beside it, there was the faint sound of running water. Besides that, there was only the faint fragrance of lemongrass mixed with a slight smell of blood. The smell of blood? My heart tightened, and countless plots from my previous life immediately flashed through my mind. Without thinking, I pushed open the door of the lounge beside me. And just at the moment when I opened the door, the sound of running water in the washroom of the lounge suddenly stopped. Cashin walked out while wiping his wet hair, but the moment his eyes met mine, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. "Serafina." My eyes couldn't help but fall on him. I had always known that Cashin was very good looking, but most of the time, he always had that cold expression on his face, which made him look distant. However, at this moment, because of the mist in the air, his originally cold and stern eyebrows and eyes softened. The water droplets rolling down from the ends of his hair flowed down along the smooth muscle lines and disappeared at the edge of the towel around his waist. The cold white skin usually covered by the suit fabric was now fully exposed, and a small mole on his waist was clearly visible, showing a bit of allure. Besides, there were several circles of gauze wrapped around his left forearm, which had been soaked by water and faintly showed some red of blood. Sure enough, he was injured. Get out. Perhaps my burning gaze was too obvious. Cashin closed his eyes and scolded coldly. But his tone didn't have much deterrence. Driven by either the alcohol or instinct, I blinked. Instead of going out, I took a few steps inside and closed the door behind me. You're injured, I said as I walked towards him step by step. Cashin, how did it happen? And your wound has started bleeding again. It needs to be rebandaged. It's just a minor injury. Cashin said indifferently, I'll deal with it myself. It has nothing to do with you. Then he paused for a moment. Serafina, you shouldn't be in my office right now. After all, your boyfriend. I directly wrapped my arms around his neck and pressed a kiss laced with the smell of alcohol onto his lips, blocking whatever he was about to say. Stop talking. There's nothing you say that I want to hear, I murmured somewhat indistinctly. As our lips rubbed against each other, the temperature gradually became scalding hot. With our steps in disarray, he and I stumbled and fell onto the big bed beside us. Even the bath towel was pulled apart as our bodies rubbed against each other. After this long and deep kiss ended, I propped myself up on Cashin's shoulders, gasping for breath continuously. I saw that his eyes were filled with surging, dark desire. But still, with some difficulty, he asked, Is it for him this time? Of course it's for myself, I said, then stood on tiptoe and pressed my lips against his again. At 4 o'clock in the morning, I stepped on the carpet with my weak body and could hardly stand steadily. Cashin hooked my waist with his uninjured arm and pulled me back. You should rest, Serafina. I tried hard to look back at him, but your wound really needs to be rebandaged, and how on earth did you get injured? Cashin suddenly fell silent. In the suffocating silence, I suddenly realized something. Don't you think I'm trying to pry information about you for Damien now? He stared straight at me, obviously acquiescing. I felt a bit sad and also a bit angry. We've already done this kind of thing. I've already said that I was afraid you'd be in danger, so I went to Damien to find out about their plan to deal with you. Why won't you believe me? I believed you before. Cashin's voice was very soft. I believed you many times in these 2 years, Serafina. Suddenly it felt like something was stuck in my throat. I blinked my somewhat sore eyes and heard him continue, but whether to believe or not doesn't matter anymore. From now on, no matter how sweet your words are, I won't let you go again. As for that Damien, he's not as simple as you think. I blurted out. Seeing Cashin's frowning expression, I couldn't help but take a deep breath. If I said that in my past life, I died at his hands, would you believe me? The heavy rain outside the window was beating against the glass. It was so dark that not a ray of moonlight could be seen. Under the ambiguous light in the room, Cashin opposite me seemed to freeze. Past life? Cashin, have you ever thought that we are actually characters in a book? After hesitating for a moment and thinking about the terrifying power of the original plot, I decided to tell Cashin everything. I don't know if it was a dream or a real past life that actually existed. Anyway, in my last life, from the moment Damien appeared, it seemed that I could only see him in my eyes. By the time I finished narrating the 10 years of the past life, the rain outside the window had long stopped. The sky was spreading a pale golden glow. That last project cost my parents their lives and also enabled Damien to successfully annex all of my family's industries. He said he hated me because in these 10 years by my side, he had endured unimaginable humiliation. After that, he sent me to a mental hospital on the grounds that I was too shocked and had a mental breakdown. Speaking of this, I suddenly choked up a bit. Even though so much time had passed and everything had started over, those 6 months in the mental hospital still felt like a nightmare to me. Every day, my hands and feet were bound, and I was forced to be injected with excessive doses of medicine. My mind was muddled, and there was hardly a moment when I was sober. I also had to endure the near-death pain of electric shocks regularly. So later, after finally regaining my sanity, I escaped from the ward and jumped off the roof of the hospital. My voice with a slight tremor at the end was drowned in Cashin's sudden embrace and his body temperature. His hand passed through my hair, pressing my head against his chest. It was just a dream. I won't let that happen. Yes, you won't. I closed my eyes in his arms. In front of my eyes, it seemed that the flames all over the sky at the wedding that day appeared again. So even if in the dream you couldn't defeat the power of the original plot and couldn't save me, you still sent Damien to hell at the moment when he was the happiest and most fulfilled. The familiar smell coming from Cashin and the drowsiness brought by staying awake all night made me fall into a deep sleep quickly. In the dream, it seemed that I had returned to my past life. During those 10 years when Cashin and I were at loggerheads, whenever we met in public, I attacked him with the most vicious words and tried to suppress him at all costs. But he still wore the perfume with the scent of lemongrass. When I was alive, I hated him to the extreme and never paid attention to it. It was not until the moment when I watched him being swallowed by the flames that I suddenly understood. Because that was the last gift that Serafina, who was 18 years old and hadn't met Damien yet, gave to Cashin. The first thing I did after waking up was to take Cashin to the hospital to have his wound retreated. Don't let it get wet again, and don't use this arm for 7 days, the doctor solemnly instructed. You can leave now. Sitting in the car, I turned to ask Cashin, can you tell me now how you got injured exactly? He stared into my eyes in the slightly dim car and sighed softly. Actually, it was just an accident when I went to the project construction site for on-site inspection. I suddenly bit my lip. Was it related to Damien? Cashin's warm fingertips reached over, separated my teeth and lips, and then rubbed my lips soothingly. Don't worry. The only way he can hurt me is through you. So, you just need to stay away from him. Leave the rest to me, okay? But I don't want to do that. I grasped his somewhat seductive fingers and said seriously, Cashin, I'm someone who has died once. In a sense, I'm even older than you now. Whatever you're going to do, however you're going to deal with Damien, let me know. Include me, okay? He was silent for a moment and then quietly replied, okay. Serafina, I won't interfere with your decision. But you should try to stay away from Damien as much as possible. I nodded and suddenly felt like teasing him. Are you afraid that I'll be bewitched by Damien again? Cashin nodded calmly. Behind his drooping eyelashes, a hint of vulnerability that he couldn't hide well flashed by. He was afraid. It turned out that Cashin, who had gradually taken over the Cashin family at the age of 16 and was rumored to be decisive in killing and cutting, could also feel afraid. I cupped Cashin's face and said seriously, Cashin, we've known each other since the day I was born. When I was a child, I was weak and often sick and lived in the hospital. It was you who brought a bunch of flowers and comic books to see me every day. When I got my first period at the age of 14, it was you who went to buy sanitary napkins for me. After we secretly kissed when I was 18, I've been dreaming about you all the time. Without the forced brainwashing of the original plot, I wouldn't have even glanced at Damien. I've always loved you and only you. These words were like the key that suddenly opened Pandora's box. He kissed me all at once. After that day, Damien didn't contact me for a long time. I went to the hospital to inquire around and only then found out that he didn't know through whose connections he had already invited another tumor expert out of retirement to help his mother complete the operation. This was probably his male lead halo. Near graduation, I simply entered my family's company for an internship in advance. And because the Serafina family had maintained cooperation with the Cashin family for a long time, I had more legitimate opportunities to have contact with Cashin. I'm planning to go to Damien's studio later, I said as I sat opposite Cashin and took a bite of the bagel in my hand. According to the progress of the past life, at this time, You and I had already fallen out, and I started to use my family's resources to help Damien expand his network and snatched a very important project from you. Cashin suddenly looked up at me. Under the cover of his long eyelashes, the emotions in his eyes were not concealed at all. I quickly added, I'm just going to test it out and see how far his current plan has progressed. Wait for me to come home for dinner tonight. Damien's studio was not far from the city center. With the network he had at the beginning, if it weren't for my unsparing help, he wouldn't have been able to afford to rent this place at all. When I went in, I happened to see Delilah sitting in front of his desk. Damien was standing behind her, bending over and almost enclosing her whole body in his arms in an extremely ambiguous posture. It was the same in my past life. I had discovered the abnormal ambiguity between him and Delilah countless times, but Damien always refused to admit it. I had quarreled with him many times because of this, and each time it was a huge uproar. When I was hysterical and almost crazy, Damien just stood aside and looked at me with a tired look. Later, all of these became evidence of my oppression and humiliation of him. Coming back to my senses from the memories, I said coldly, "What are you doing?" The two people in front of me seemed to freeze all of a sudden. After a moment, Damien straightened up and straightened his slightly wrinkled clothes. He looked at me, but his words were for Delilah, "You can leave first." Delilah gave me an angry glare and got up and left. With only the two of us left in the room, Damien put on that cold expression again. "Didn't you leave with Cashin? Why are you still coming to me?" He still tried to manipulate me with the old tricks. Indeed, if it were the Serafina controlled by the original plot, at this time, she would lower her stance and apologize, saying that she only loved him, and then try every means to provide help for his studio, proving that only she could give him some things. I, Serafina, raised my chin. Recently, there's a project in my family's company. Originally, it was going to cooperate with the Cashin family, but I want to choose you. Damien suddenly raised his eyes to look at me, and his Adam's apple bobbed. I curled the corners of my mouth. However, that project has a very long cycle and involves a huge amount of funds. I need to first determine how much you can handle. In the evening when I went back, combining the plot of my previous life, I told Cashin the things I had found out. I suspect that because of my rebirth, the progress of the plot has been advanced. Damien has already hooked up with Hades, the newly appointed gang boss in the South City. In my previous life, he didn't get to know that person until several years later. Moreover, with his current power, cooperating with that kind of person is no different from seeking skin from a tiger. Thinking of this, I, Serafina, frowned. Cashin, who had been looking through the contract, paused for a moment and then raised his eyes to look at me. That's because Mordred can no longer offer him any help. I was startled. For the project in Haicheng, they planted spies in the subsidiary company, stole the accounts, and fabricated false appearances. Now Mordred and his men are already in prison. He turned over a page of the materials in his hand, his tone as calm as usual. Damien's company is still in its infancy. He's too weak and can only rely on others. I suddenly realized, you made this happen. Cashin didn't refute, obviously acquiescing. I blinked and threw myself into his arms. Cashin, you're so amazing. He caught my hand that was wandering around with a flirtatious intention and suddenly put on a serious expression. Serafina, don't get involved in the things that follow. Why? Because it's very dangerous. As he spoke, Serafina frowned. Damien's identity is not as simple as you think. Otherwise, Hades wouldn't have agreed to cooperate with him so readily. I was suddenly stunned. You said that in my previous life, I chose the most tragic way to perish together with them. Cashin's tone was still unhurried, but somehow it carried a bone-chilling coldness. That should be because, apart from that, I had no other way. That night, I had another dream. I dreamed that in the 6th year after I married Damien in my previous life, at a certain dinner party, I saw him standing close to Bellatrix, Hades' daughter, in an intimate posture. So, for no reason, I went crazy with jealousy. I lost my mind and sent people to kidnap Bellatrix. Instead, I was taken away by Hades' men. The cold dagger was pressed against my neck and then moved down along the lines of my body. I thought I was going to die there. Finally, Damien, with an indifferent look on his face, pushed the door open and walked in, taking me out of the gang's place. Because of this, in my previous life, I always thought that he was just a bit cold on the surface and still had feelings for me in his heart. But in this dream, like a movie with a sudden change of shot, I saw Hades with a scarred face and Cassian beside him with an expressionless face in another room. There was a large screen in front of them, and the picture was frozen on the scene where the dagger was pressed against my neck. Hades chuckled twice. Well, President Cassian, have you thought about cooperating with me? Cassian looked at my tear-stained face with his beautiful eyes, and his expression didn't change at all. A few seconds later, he looked away. I agree. Let Serafina leave safely. Hades smiled with satisfaction. President Cassian is a smart man. Too bad. If you were willing to become my son-in-law, we would be family in the future. Cassian said distantly, I'm not worthy of such an honor. After he got up and left, Damien and Bellatrix pushed the door open and walked in. Bellatrix sighed regretfully. Dad, has Cassian agreed to cooperate with us? Hades nodded. Such poor taste. He'd rather like that extremely stupid Serafina than marry me. She smiled and turned her head to look at Damien. Brother, when on earth are you going to divorce this fool and marry Sister Delilah? I suddenly opened my eyes. It was pitch dark in front of me, and only a ray of moonlight shone in through the window. Serafina. The scenes in the dream still lingered in my mind and were combined with the other information I already knew, allowing me to quickly figure out the information that had been hidden beneath the surface in my previous life. Serafina. I just moved a little and then I was pulled into Cassian's arms by his side. He held me, was quiet for a few seconds, and then said with concern, You're shaking. I know. I closed my eyes and felt the familiar fresh fragrance on him. I know, Cassian, Damien is Hades' illegitimate son. Hades agreed to cooperate with him now because they have already recognized each other as father and son. Cassian didn't care at all about Damien's true identity. He just hugged me tighter. What did you dream about? I wrapped my arms around his narrow waist, my voice choked with sobs. I'm sorry, Cassian. I finally realized that in my previous life, under the plot of Damien and the Zhao family, I became a hostage to threaten Cassian. The business of the Cassian family was forced to be involved in shady and illegal activities. So in the end, Cassian chose to perish together with everyone at that grand wedding. Fortunately, in this life, I woke up from the shackles of the original plot. Everything was still in time. When I calmed down, I repeated the scenes in the dream. Cassian's hand that had been resting on my back suddenly tightened, and his voice was filled with a bone-chilling coldness that was almost frozen. Bellatrix, I got it. Under my deliberate guidance, the Serafina family soon reached the first phase cooperation of the project with Damien's studio. Hades also got involved. At this time, it was still early. He hadn't dominated the whole Hiching like he did in my previous life. So during the progress of the project, many flaws that hadn't been tidied up in time were left. All of these were collected by Cassian and would be used as evidence to send him to court for trial in the future. However, Cassian hadn't contacted me in the past few days. That afternoon, I went to his company to look for him. Downstairs, I found a strange bright pink sports car. The car door opened, and a familiar figure got out. I suddenly froze. It was Bellatrix who was several years younger. I saw her walking briskly to the other side and opening the car door. Then Cassian, dressed in a suit, walked out with a faint smile on his lips. I didn't know what he said, but Bellatrix covered her mouth and laughed, then took out something like a letter from her small bag and handed it to him. Then she got into the car and left. Cassian stood there, his eyes scanning around. When his gaze passed by my car, he paused for a moment. I was quite sure that he had recognized me. However, as if he hadn't seen anything, he calmly shifted his gaze and went upstairs. Suddenly, an endless sense of bitterness spread in my heart. So was this how Cashin felt every time he saw me with Damien in the past countless times? I opened the car door, went upstairs, and found Cashin in his office. He looked up from behind his desk. "Why didn't you knock?" I said sourly. "Did Bellatrix need to knock when she came to see you?" Cashin was silent for a moment and then suddenly stood up and walked towards the lounge beside him. While walking, he took off his tie and undid the top 2 buttons of his shirt collar. He stood in the lounge, looking at me with his collar half open. "Come here." I deliberately dawdled in dissatisfaction and walked over slowly. As soon as I entered the lounge, the door suddenly closed behind me. My back was pressed against the hard and cold door panel, but my chest was pressed tightly against Cashin's burning body temperature. He held my shoulders, and his wet kisses with traces of water spread from my lips to my ears and then moved down along the lines of my body inch by inch. Cashin knew me too well. Including my reactions. My limits. The meaning represented by every tremble of my body. I felt like I was thrown high into the clouds and then suddenly dropped into the boundless sea. Cashin, I could only tremble and call out his name before being thrown back into the boundless sea of pleasure again. In the end, before being completely swallowed by the waves, I heard his hoarse voice, hot with breath, ringing in my ear. "Are you done checking? I'm still completely and only yours." I read the letter that Bellatrix handed to Cashin over and over again. I found that it was an invitation to her birthday party. As the main person in charge of the project of the Serafina family hat was cooperating with the Zhao family, I also received one. "It'll be very dangerous that day. I'd rather you didn't go." Cashin looked at me with his glassy, clear eyes. "But will you listen to me, Serafina?" I shook my head honestly. "No." Then I quickly added, "Because normally, we are currently cooperating and the progress is going smoothly. If I don't go to the banquet for no reason, it might arouse their suspicions." This reason was so sufficient that even Cashin couldn't refute it. He stared at me for a while and then came over to kiss me again. "Whatever happens, Serafina, remember that your own safety is the most important thing." Soon, it was the day of Bellatrix's birthday party. The project of the Serafina family was actually cooperating with the authorities, so many powerful and wealthy people came. And Damien, as one of the 3 parties in the cooperation, also successfully got to know quite a number of connections because of this. I held a glass of wine and watched coldly as Delilah followed behind him. As if sensing my gaze, she suddenly turned around and gave me a proud and provocative look. Then, as if to show off, she took Damien's arm. "Such trash. You can keep it for yourself." Looking around the venue, I found quite a number of familiar faces among the guests who came here. These were all the partners that Damien wasn't supposed to meet until several years later in my previous life. Was it because Cashin took the initiative that everything was advanced? Just when I seemed to understand something, Bellatrix, the protagonist of today's banquet, appeared. She had one hand on Hades' arm, and on the other side stood Cashin with a gentle smile. "Welcome everyone to my birthday party," she said with a smile, and when her eyes swept over my face, there was a bit of complacency in them. A waiter pushed out a huge 3-layer cake. She cut the cake and came down with Cashin to chat with the guests. Soon, they walked up to me. "Serafina, I hope we can have a pleasant cooperation in the following projects." Bellatrix smiled at me and suddenly turned to ask Cashin, "I heard that you used to have a very good relationship with Serafina and even had a childhood betrothal?" It was just a joke made by our parents. It shouldn't be taken seriously. Cashin's gaze swept over me indifferently and then moved away coldly. "Besides, Serafina already has someone she loves. We have nothing to do with each other now." Although I knew he was just acting, I was still so angry that I almost ground my teeth to pieces. After a long while, I finally sneered disdainfully, "I should thank President Cashin for finally letting me go." He left with Bellatrix side by side. Holding a wine glass, I quickly found Song near the French window by the garden. He was on the phone, and Delilah beside him was nowhere to be seen. I didn't know what the person on the other end of the phone said, but his expression gradually became solemn. Outside the window, the first firework burst open in the pitch-black night sky. Then, countless more followed, becoming more and more frequent. This was supposed to be the fireworks to celebrate Bellatrix's birthday, but it perfectly covered up the gunshots from the fierce battle after the gang's secret weapons depot was discovered not far away. Remembering Cashin's previous instructions, I quietly retreated to the corner step by step. Just as I was about to leave along the garden path, suddenly, a bloodied figure rushed in through the main entrance, shouting, "Boss, our deal has been discovered." With a bang, a huge crystal chandelier crashed to the ground, making a deafening noise. The entire hall instantly plunged into darkness, and chaos ensued. Afraid of getting caught in the crossfire, I obediently hid in the corner and watched the police officers who had infiltrated the banquet subdue Run's subordinates one by one. Serafina. Finally, Cashin's voice rang in my ear. Taking advantage of the cover of darkness, he came to my side and whispered, "The Zhao family's power has been deeply entrenched for so many years. There might be more backup plans later. Let's leave first." I nodded, and my originally tense heart gradually relaxed. However, just as we managed to avoid the chaotic crowd and reached the garden, the night wind blew over with a mixed fragrance of unknown flowers, and suddenly I smelled something unusual. It was like a premonition from my past life. My pupils constricted, and I suddenly pushed Cashin to the ground and quickly rolled to the side twice. In the next second, where we were supposed to be, a series of bullets kicked up dust all over the ground. I staggered to my feet, and then I was immediately targeted by the pitch-black muzzle of a gun. "It's really you." Damien held the gun and looked at me with almost hatred in his eyes. "Since you like me, why do you keep sabotaging my career and opportunities for development? Since you adore me, you should be willing to give to me wholeheartedly without asking for anything in return. But while you say you like me, you just look down on me with condescending and sympathetic eyes, looking at me from a superior position. Serafina, you really make me sick." Even though I had a second chance at life, I was still left speechless by Damien's shameless words. So in my past life, no matter how nice I was to him and how much I did to help him with all my strength, in his eyes, it was still humiliation. Because deep down, he thought that when I offered him help, I shouldn't ask for anything in return. Do I look like a sucker? I was so irritated by his absurd logic that I couldn't help saying that we didn't even know each other. "I gave you money to help you, and you should thank me. If you felt insulted, you should have thrown the money in my face and told me that you could make a name for yourself completely on your own and didn't need my stinking money. But you didn't. The truth is that even after you got involved with Hades, you still had to rely on cooperating with me and the Serafina family to get the projects you wanted. Without my help, you're just a good-for-nothing loser." The more I talked, the paler Damien's face became. But he still gritted his teeth and said, "A young lady like you who has been carefree since birth doesn't understand. It has nothing to do with one's origin." Cashin suddenly let out a light chuckle and interrupted Damien. "All you can do is shift the blame and complain. Even if you were born into our families, nothing would change. Just like now, even though you've recognized your father, you're still someone who can only exchange your looks for opportunities, a useless piece of trash." His eyes were full of contempt without any concealment. And yet, he seemed to have been prepared for it. At the moment when Damien lost his mind and pulled the trigger, he suddenly pushed me aside. There was more than one gunshot. The bullet pierced through flesh and blood, bursting out a bloody flower with the smell of gunpowder. A few drops of warm blood splashed onto my face. All I could see in my vision was a sea of red and his eyes slowly closing. Cashin. In the ward, the smell of disinfectant was overwhelming, diluting the lemongrass scent on Cashin's body. I sat beside his hospital bed, gritting my teeth and saying, "Are you crazy?" His eyelashes trembled, and he looked at me with gentle and affectionate eyes. "Sorry, Serafina, I just wanted to test something. After we've made so many efforts to break free from that irresistible force, I wanted to see if the ending of your past life would repeat itself." This was the reason why he deliberately provoked Damien to make him shoot at him. In fact, The police officers who had been planted there had already noticed that someone was missing in the chaotic hall and had chased after them. At the same moment when Damien pulled the trigger, they also fired, shooting through his wrist and temple. If the influence of the original plot couldn't be shaken off, Cashin would surely die under Damien's gun. Instead of just getting shot in the shoulder like now because the muzzle had successfully shifted. But there were many ways for you to test it. Did you have to risk your life? This was the safest way. His lips were as pale as paper due to excessive blood loss, but his gaze never left me for a moment. If I had really died, Damien would undoubtedly be sentenced to death. You wouldn't have any more contact with him, and you wouldn't be sent to the mental hospital either. For the next few decades, you would have a stable life of your own, Serafina. He paused for a moment, and his voice became even softer. It fell into my ears as light as a feather, yet it seemed to carry the power of a thunderbolt. I said I wouldn't let what happened in your dream happen. I stared at Cashin in a daze, feeling as if my throat was blocked by an invisible mass of air, unable to say a word. He was really a bit crazy, so he'd rather bet with his own life. If he won, it would prove that we had both broken free from the shadow of our past lives. If he lost, he could use his death to ensure my safety for the rest of my life. I thought of the medicine I was injected with in my past life, of falling from a tall building. I thought of the look in Cashin's eyes when he saw my tear-stained face in the dim private room. I thought of the sudden explosion of flames at Damien's grand wedding. I thought of the lemongrass scent on Cashin that had remained the same for over 10 years. With a surge of tears, I suddenly grabbed his collar forcefully, leaned in, and bit his lip hard. The sweet and fishy smell of blood filled my mouth for a moment. That's not okay either. I said word by word, your life belongs to me. Okay, it's yours. Cashin's originally cold and indifferent eyes were now filled with a kind of wet and affectionate look. Everything of mine is yours. In those days, Cashin managed to get in touch with Bellatrix and gathered information from her. He cooperated with the police to smash a weapons deal involving over 1 billion yuan. Because of charges such as participating in illegal and criminal activities, intentional homicide, and illegal gun possession, Song Shao, Hades, Bellatrix, and others were sentenced to death. All the guests at the birthday dinner and Hades' hidden network of connections were also being gradually investigated clearly. Although Delilah didn't have direct contact with the case itself, she was also sentenced to 2 years in prison for providing some assistance. And the second and third phases of the projects of the Serafina family naturally continued to reach cooperation with the Cashin family. In the name of work, I suddenly had a lot more time to spend with Cashin. However, no matter how much he tried to seduce me, I always kept a straight face and refused. Your wound hasn't healed yet. We'll talk about it after it's completely healed. After saying that, I couldn't help scolding him. You dare to drink when you still have a gunshot wound. Do you want to die? The white shirt soaked by hot water clung wetly to his body. Cashin opened his eyes, and there was still a hazy look in his pupils brought by the drunkenness. A smile of indulgence and helplessness curved on his lips. Sorry, Serafina, he was seducing me again. I swallowed hard, pretended to be cold, and threw the shower head to him. Take off your clothes and take a shower by yourself. I'm leaving first. In the bathroom filled with hot mist, I had only walked a few steps when suddenly there was a sound of something heavy falling behind me. After hesitating for a moment, my concern for Cashin prevailed. I turned around and quickly walked back. Then, at the moment when I bent down, he hooked his arm around my neck, and we both fell into the huge circular bathtub together. With a splash, water splashed everywhere. I couldn't help screaming, the haute couture dress that just arrived last week. I'll buy you 10 tomorrow. His hot breath was close to my ear, becoming hotter and hotter bit by bit. Serafina, help me. The kisses landed on my lips, rubbing and lingering until there was a faint stinging sensation, and then he reluctantly left. But then, with heat, they moved downwards and disappeared under the water. How can I help you? The suddenly high-pitched trembling ending of my voice was swallowed up by the passionate kisses. It's too hot. Help me cool down. Liar. How could I help him cool down? I could only be led by him and fall into the humid tropical rainforest together. Then suddenly, there was a heavy rain. With a slightly cool touch, it flowed into the depths of the river. We didn't stop until late at night, and then I fell into a deep sleep. In a daze, I had a dream again. In the dream, I couldn't tell whether it was my past life or this life, because it was a moment before Damien had appeared. I was wearing my high school uniform and found a love letter written by a boy in my school bag. Then, like a movie scene, the picture changed. The boy was standing among a few guys who looked like hooligans, biting a cigarette and looking malicious. So what if she's the young lady of the Serafina family? When I trick her into going on a date and drug her drink, we can do whatever we want with her. The next day, on his way to school, he was hit by a speeding car and broke his leg. In the pale white ward, Cashin pushed the door open and looked at him expressionlessly. This is a warning. If you have any more improper thoughts, who knows what will be broken next time. Then the ward door closed. He picked up the phone. On the other end came the pampered voice of 17-year-old Serafina. Cashin, my birthday is coming soon. What gift have you prepared for me? Humph, if it's something I don't like, don't even think about going on a spring outing with me next month. Cashin smiled, and his tone was full of indulgence. I've already put it on your desk. You'll see it when you go home after school. Outside the window of the hospital corridor, the sun was shining brightly, and cherry blossoms were in full bloom. The gentle breeze blew the pale pink petals slowly past. It was the spring when everything had yet to begin. The end.